I'm Fleur, also known on the vintage scene as Fleur de Guerre, and I'm here with my vintage girlfriends. We just all share an absolute passion for the 1940s. Clothes, lifestyle, music, generally enjoying every part of the designs and styles of the 1940s. For me, it's 90% the clothes and hair, and a lot of interest in the social history, but without that burning urge to, I wish I could go back to the 1940s. That's not really how I feel. There was a war on, people didn't have much food, they didn't have much money. There was a lot more of that community spirit back then because we were going through something so awful. I bought my very first vintage dress in America in, I think it was 2005, and now I've got more clothes than I could wear in a year, so. Vintage stuff is obviously by default getting more scarce as time goes on, and the more popular it gets, the prices are going up. Now, the problem with sourcing authentic vintage from the UK is that it's just so hard to come by, because during the war, we wore our clothes until they fell to rags, and then we used the rags to clean the house with. Spotting genuine vintage is not difficult when you know what you're looking for, and there are some ways that you can tell. You can buy books which collect clothing catalogue plates and things like that, so you can just look at the general shapes. You can generally tell whether something's genuinely vintage. The first thing is obviously usually a vintage dress has been around for a long time. Some of the best ones have probably been worn quite a lot. So if you take this one for example, it's been quite well loved, it's quite faded, some of the seams need to be replaced, but it's been hand sewn beautifully well because that's what they did back then. But when something doesn't have any fastenings, usually it's just a case of knowing. So if you don't know, there are certain other ways that it's easier to tell. What you can see immediately is that it has a metal zip, and the metal zip is at the side. Generally, if the zip is on the side, it's probably from the 40s. If it's up the back, they didn't really have zips up the back in the 40s at all. That was a 50s and 60s thing. Any zip genuinely from the 60s and earlier will be metal. If it's earlier, if it's a 30s dress, it'll have a popper rather than a zip, because they didn't have commercially produced zips back in the 30s. The other way to tell if it's definitely pre-60s is the finishing on the inside. They didn't have any overlockers in the 40s. They didn't really have them in the factories. They certainly didn't have them in the home. If you take, for example, this pinafore dress, this is a perfectly 1940s style of dress, but it's definitely not from the 1940s. It might possibly even be from the 1970s, because pinafores were quite big in the 70s, although they were full-length ones then. Now, the way that I can tell that is that it's got the overlock finishing on the inside. So if you see the zigzag, then you know that it hasn't been made in the 1940s. Things from the 1940s generally, even if they're shop bought and have a shop label, they won't have a size label, because the size label was made of paper. So as soon as it was washed, then it will dissolve. For example, I've just recently managed to find this. It's a brand called Princess Peggy that went out of business in the 50s, going since the 20s. This is actually culottes. It's a sort of an all-in-one culotte dress. But the Princess Peggy label is there, and underneath you've got a paper size label, size 12. You can tell this has never been washed or worn, because the paper label's still there and it hasn't dissolved in the wash. They were definitely not shy about colours in the 40s and 50s. You don't see it quite so much because of the black and white pictures of the time, but people would wear oranges and blues together, and bright green and bright pink, and reds and oranges, and all sorts of things. And some of the fabrics are so vibrant and so bright and so much more fun.
After a hot day in the fields, hot swing in the barn.
Throughout the 1930s, America, and to a lesser extent the rest of the world, was in a recession. Something that women quickly cottoned onto was that they would reuse the cotton bags that their flour and their animal feed came in, because obviously, you didn't have any convenience food, so they'd buy big huge supplies worth, months worth of flour and things like that. And the cotton that they came in was very soft and nice, so the feed sack companies realised they were absolutely missing a trick here, and they would provide their product in a bag made of printed cotton. And feed sack dresses are an absolutely typical thing of the 30s and of course the 40s. You can instantly tell that it's a feed sack dress from the point of view that the fabric is it's very lovely and soft, but it's quite loosely woven cotton. It's got this jazzy sort of print on it, and none of the sections of the material are particularly big, so it's been done with a panelled skirt because you couldn't get sections of feed sack larger than about a yard. There's just a really big backlash happening, which vintage fits in really well with, which is against the kind of mass-produced disposable fashion. I mean, an item of clothing that you bought for £4 from one of the budget high street shops is not going to be around in 60 years' time. There are tons of 1940s parties and club nights and weekends and things if you want to dress up for a special thing, and the beauty of that is, everyone else is going to be dressed up and you're not going to get any funny looks. If you go out like it's the most natural thing in the world, then the vast majority of the time all you're going to get is compliments.
We get to wear exactly what we want to. We're not dictated by trends or fashions, and it's great going out with a bunch of girls who all look equally fabulous.
I love history, that's a big passion of mine, so to be able to sort of combine fashion, music, history, yeah.